Hello, the title of this lecture is The Renaissance, and I will be looking at its early stage in Italy and also it moving to Northern Europe. And in addition, I want to actually make a reference to what some intellectuals refer to as the Dark Ages. The Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. And this occurred when philosophers and artists looked back to ancient Greek and Roman civilization to better understand their own society. The Renaissance took place between the years roughly 1350, some suggest 1375, and lasted until approximately the year 1600. And again, first it was at the northern city-states of Italy, and about 100 years later it moved to Northern Europe. Now, I want to say a few things about the years before the Renaissance period. The years before the Renaissance reached, particularly before it reached Northern Europe, it was a time of struggle. You had the 100 Years' War between England and France that went from the year 1337 to 1453. And this war sapped the economic resources of both nations. There was the deliberate policy of pillage and destruction that took place in large areas of Western France. In addition, there was the Black Death of the mid 1300s, and this was the most dramatic episode of death with millions of people perishing. There was also disruption of the church. In 1309, the papacy moved headquarters from Rome to Avignon, France, and almost 70 years later, the papacy returned to Rome, but additional disagreement resulted in the splitting of Western Christianity, and consequently, there was a pope in Avignon, and at the same time, there was a pope in Rome. Wanting to distance themselves from the medieval world, scholars coined the term Renaissance to mark a new period when there was a great appreciation for the ancient Greeks and Romans. A better way for society was to look to the classical works of antiquity. And for some of these intellectuals, the Middle Age became viewed as the Dark Ages. Now, recently, some scholars have challenged the idea of a Dark Age. In fact, they argue that, quote, during the so-called Dark Ages, European technology and science overtook and surpassed the rest of the world. One study argues the idea that Europe fell into the Dark Ages is a hoax originated by anti-religious 18th century intellectuals who were determined to assert the cultural superiority of their own time. And we also get various scholars who were during the Renaissance period, so before the Enlightenment of the 18th century, we have the Renaissance writers, commentators of the 15th and 16th century who have a similar view, looking back at the medieval period as sort of like a dark age. Now, a closer look at the medieval age reveals that the progress of Western civilization was actually quite steady. So the argument can be made then that there were a significant number of achievements during this period. It was during the so-called Dark Ages when people embraced Christian doctrines of equality, of moral equality, that, quote, created a whole new world based on political, economic, and personal freedom. And there were other achievements during the Middle Age. In the 12th century, capitalism rose in the Italian city-states and it spread northward. In the book, The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success, Rodney Stark writes, quote, "It all began in the great monastic estates as the monks replaced their subsistence economies and became highly productive, specialized participants in rapidly expanding trading networks, thereby giving birth to capitalism." Other achievements of the medieval period were banks. And this where we see the emergence of banks, and this took place in Italy. Another achievement was double entry bookkeeping, where you had credit and debit figures. There was also treadle powered looms, foot powered for being able to process clothing. There were spinning wheels. There was the invention of eyeglasses, which goes back to the year 1284, and there was the development of the three-field system, where you would have spring crop, fallow, winter crop, and then that would be followed by winter crop, spring crop, and the third allowed to fallow. Another invention during the medieval age was the horse stirrup. And for actually something that was very useful was the well-paddled collar that put weight from the horse's neck to shoulder. And this collar that went over the head of a horse was quite impressive, and actually allowed the horse to outplow an oxen 2 times as much. Again, taking that force from the horse's neck and applying it more to the shoulders. So we see that there were a number of significant achievements during the medieval age. And thus, the people who are challenging the notion of a dark age, they look at this survey of medieval developments, and they believe it reveals a much different picture than the one portrayed by those who argued that there was these dark ages. As Rodney Stark argues, the remarkable developments of the medieval period were due, quote, to the unique Christian conviction that progress was a God-given obligation entailed in the gift of reason. And thus what we see is that medieval theologians presented the intellectual basis for experiments with political freedom. Some find this interpretation of the Middle Age maybe pretty good, convincing, yes. But others see the Renaissance as a distinct transition between the medieval age and the modern age. And certainly one can point to the rise of cultural creativity of the 1400s. And certainly the Italians made their mark in this era. And 2 important examples are Leonardo Bruni and Leonardo da Vinci. Most have heard of the latter. But Leonardo Bruni. Bruni was born in the year 1374 and he died in 1444, and he was from Florence. And Bruni argued for the scholarly approach of humanism. Now this is a term that has been difficult to define. Scholars sort of debate and argue what exactly does humanism mean. But even though it is difficult to define precisely, I would say that humanism was an educational approach that focused on human dignity and individualism. It was key to study Greek and Latin classics as both, quote, an end in itself and as a guide to reforming society. I'll just read that last part again. An end in itself and as a guide to reforming society. And just to give you a sense of Bruni's thinking, I've taken a passage from one of his writings, and this is actually a letter. This is a letter to a young scholar. So Bruni writes this letter to this young scholar, and he writes, quote, "Devote yourself to two kinds of study. In the first place, acquire a knowledge of letters, not the common run of it, but the more searching and profound kind in which I very much want you to shine. Second, acquaint yourself with what pertains to life and manners, those things that are called humane studies, because they are perfect and adorn man. In this kind of study, your knowledge should be wide, varied, and taken from every sort of experience, leaving out nothing that might seem to contribute to the conduct of your life, to honor, and to fame. So here we see Bruni is again wanting this young scholar to read broadly, read a lot. And actually later on he's specific. He points to the example of the readings of Cicero, but reading Cicero was not enough. Reading any one classical writer was not enough. To be an outstanding and learned man, reading widely was paramount. And let me just read a little bit more what he says here. Quote, "Thus one must not only learn from the scholars, which he actually believes is the foundation of all study, but must also get instruction from poets, orators, and historians, so that one style may become eloquent, elegant, and never crude in substance." End of quote. So here we have then with the Renaissance, this real focus on education, but not just any education. You got to go back to the classics, go back to the Greek and Latin classics. Now, the painter Leonardo da Vinci, he was the most outstanding artist of the Renaissance. But he was more than a painter. He was fascinated with the world. He sought to, quote, learn causes of things. Learn the causes of things. And I want to also read a passage from some of his writing. And these comments that follow are him discussing sketching. Quote, when you have thoroughly learned perspective and have fixed in your memory all the various parts and forms of things, You should often amuse yourself when you take a walk for recreation in watching and taking note of the attitudes and actions of men as they talk and dispute, or laugh, or come to blows one with another. Both their actions and those of the bystanders who either intervene or stand looking on at these things, noting these noting these down with rapid strokes in this way in a little pocket book, which you ought always to carry with you. End of quote. Here we see, Da Vinci's, talking more about, finding subjects of sketching. He's got this curiosity of the world, got a curiosity of human behavior, and we see that he is really an excellent representative of this age when there was this great curiosity of man and the world. And connected to this was an emphasis on individuals using their gifts of body and mind. And it was a full package for these Renaissance thinkers. Not only the mind, but also taking care of one's body. Now, why Italy first? Why not in other parts of Europe? Well, there are several reasons why it was Italy that launched Renaissance thinking. First were the financial resources. Unlike most of Europe, the city-states of Italy, such as Venice, Genoa, Florence, Milan, they developed flourishing international trade, commerce, and banking activities. And again, earlier I mentioned that the creation of banks was something that first occurred in Italy. Well, think about Italy, where it's located. Geographically, it's located in the middle of the exchange of East and West. So it was in an ideal place for, being part of that trading network. And also we see that, again, because of various investments, wealth creation, we have the Italian bankers and merchants experience successful business enterprises, and with a healthier economy, non-money making activities could be financed. In other words, when there's wealth, there's resources, financial resources for other things in life, things that do cost money, but not everyone can participate in it or assist this process. But because there was wealth and the resources, you could see that these non-money making activities could take place. Number two, second reason, unlike most of Europe, Italy was not heavily feudalized. Okay? So in point one, we have these city-states. We don't have that so much in Europe. And point two, we see that Italy is not as heavily feudalized. And what I mean by that is that feudalism, was weaker in Italy. And what seemed to dominate were the cities. There were strong cities. The city-states of Italy were powerful, and they were also self-governing. And the reason behind the main reason behind this is that there had been a conflict between pro-papal and pro-imperial forces. And this allowed the city-states to pretty much be be left alone and not be controlled, not be controlled by the church or controlled by the higher ups, the you know strong politicians. Also, they had a very thriving they were thriving commercial centers, and thus again similar to what I was mentioning in point one. The cities were models of cultural development, and in part that's because there's money to support such cultural development. Third reason why Italy was the first, in essence, to launch the Renaissance was Greek immigration. Greek immigration played a role in Italy ushering in the Renaissance era. Educated Greek scholars immigrated and taught Greek languages and classics. So you think of it, geographically, Greece is not too far away to the east, and we have a significant number of Greek scholars and teachers moving to Italy, and they influence the thinking there. Four, episodes of political conflict generated interest in reform. You see, within cities and actually between city states, there was considerable political power struggles. There was rivalry, okay? And as a result of this rivalry, you see an interest in the experimentation of politics and government. And this is where we have, a renewed interest, for example, in republicanism, small r republicanism. And they could, go back to the Greeks to get them started on that idea. Five, there was also the influence of the Roman model. The heritage of the Roman civilization was obvious throughout Italy. I mean, you got the Roman monuments, you have Roman roads, you have the literary manuscripts. All of this reminded the Italians that they were natural heirs of the ancient Romans. Of course, even today, when you think of buildings, the Colosseum. Now I want to just list three major characteristics of the Renaissance. First, there was individualism. In an earlier period, in previous centuries, individuals more or less saw themselves as part of a group. In the Renaissance period, an individual's uniqueness, personality, or genius received more emphasis. So more focus on the individual than was the case in the past. A second characteristic was the revival of antiquity. And there was a profound interest in the retrieval and study of Latin classics, manuscripts, statues, monuments. There was, greater interest in that earlier period. The study of ancient Latin culture became known as humanism. The humanists sought to study human nature, such as the capabilities, interests, and achievements of human beings. So earlier in this lecture, I made reference to defining humanism. Not always easy, but I think I go more with the position that it was more of as opposed to a sort of a philosophical understanding. It was more of an educational approach. But getting really more emphasis on the achievements of human beings. A third characteristic was secularization. Many Renaissance thinkers rejected the scholasticism of the medieval age, which interpreted the classics from a Christian perspective. Unlike medieval scholars, they did not study the writing of the ancients to come to know God. So rather than a sacred approach, they followed a more secular approach. Now, I do want to make one point before I move on concerning secularism. Despite the growth of secularism, very few people question the basic tenets of Christianity. Some intellectuals might be anti-clerical, but they were not agnostics. And I actually found it easy to find references to God in much of Renaissance literature. Moreover, the secular spirit had little, if any, impact on the common people. The broad mass of the people remained faithful to Christianity. Indeed, the Italian Renaissance, as a larger intellectual and cultural movement, really did not directly affect ordinary working people. In fact, there was a gap between the common masses and the elite Italian artists, writers, and humanists. The Renaissance elites represented a highly educated minority who produced work for really an exclusive elite. So much of what they were writing really was not spread very far, very widely among the population, and part of that was the population being mostly illiterate, which I will talk about later in the lecture. There were elites who shared Machiavelli's hatred for the common masses, and who I'm referring to is Niccolo Machiavelli, and his main work is the title is the Prince, and there's a suggestion, if you want to have a better understanding of most lawyers, read the Prince, read Machiavelli. Well, Niccolo Machiavelli was born in 1469 and he died in 1527. And he is famous for this short political treatise, The Prince. In The Prince, Machiavelli focuses on the issue of political power. He's very interested in power. His conclusion is pessimistic. Human beings are selfish and corrupt, and with this understanding, an astute or worthy prince should use manipulation to increase power. And this is even if it challenges, proper ethics. So you get the notion even today, one who will step over anyone to achieve a goal might be characterized as Machiavellian. And again, that suggestion, reference to lawyers. Turning to social history, Renaissance Italy valued the family structure, but there were differences in the rural and urban settings. In rural settings, the majority of the head of households were married. The peasant economy favored family labor, and bachelors were rare. So in the rural countryside, bachelors were rare. People married young to secure economic independence. A growing family of children assisted in the running of the farm. In urban settings, bachelors and widows as heads of households were more common, and this was much more common than in the rural setting. Also in the cities, males married later in life, since some believed that a wife might be more of a burden than a helper. This is in the city. Males served long years as an apprentice in some trades, and they would marry when they became established. Now, this little just picture of social history could apply to other parts of Europe, if not necessarily at this time period. Certainly, would become more common in future decades and centuries. Now, I want to turn to the spread of the Renaissance. Many of the features of the Italian Renaissance spread to the north, and this was mostly began sort of in the last quarter of the 15th century. So we see humanists in France, Germany, and England, and these humanists were interpreting Italian ideas in terms of their own societies. Now, unlike the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance had greater focus on Christian piety. There were, when we looked at the humanists in Northern Europe, there would seem to be more devotion and reverence to God. And as a result, the humanism that was really foundational in the Italian Renaissance, as it moves to Northern Europe, as the Renaissance ideas move to Northern Europe, the humanism there's some adjustments, a modification, and actually becomes known as Christian humanism. So we come up with this term Christian humanism. While Northern humanists were critical of the scholasticism of previous Christian writers, that is, writers from the medieval period, they still sought to combine the best of Christian and classical cultures. And so they were interested in the relationship of knowledge and good. So basically what we have here is that people could be more pious and ethical through education. Two of the most influential Northern humanists from the earlier period were the Dutchman Erasmus. Erasmus was born in 1466 and he passed away in 1536. And also the Englishman Thomas More. Thomas More was born just 12 years later. He was born in 1478 and he died actually the year before Erasmus died. He died in 1535, actually at the hands of Henry VIII. Erasmus. As an orphaned young boy, Erasmus entered a monastery where he developed a keen interest in the Latin language and Latin classics. In his day, Erasmus became widely known and respected. He was very prolific and he had a long list of publications. So he did a lot of writing. And of course, as a humanist, as a Christian humanist, he also did a lot of reading. Erasmus thought to have others capture the truth of Christ's message. In a critical edition of the Greek New Testament, he wrote, quote, "I utterly dissent from those who are unwilling that the sacred scriptures should be read by the unlearned, translated into their vulgar tongues, as though Christ had taught such subtleties that they can scarcely be understood even by a few theologians. End of quote. In other words, Erasmus wanted the Bible to be translated into all languages. He believed that the message of Christ could be understood by even children. And this was quite a bold idea, and it did rile a number of people who did clergy leaders who were concerned that such thinking would result in the tampering of their traditional versions of the Bible. Now, a major theme running through the scholarly work of Erasmus was that Christianity is not formalism, special ceremonies, or law. Rather, Christianity is Christ. And we can, and I don't talk about it in today's lecture, but we can see that this foreshadows. We can understand how a number of reformers found Erasmus very helpful in their ideas as they protested the church. Okay, so for Erasmus, the Sermon on the Mount expressed the heart of the Christian message. Another major theme of his work was that education and the study of the Bible and the classic was the key to moral and intellectual improvement. The Italian Renaissance thinkers, they wanted to see, the moral and intellectual improvement of people, and the same we see with these Christian humanists. But there's more of an emphasis of bringing Bible into this package, reading and studying the Bible. As explained by historian Donald Kagan and others, Erasmus, quote, believed disciplined study of the classics and the Bible would reform individuals and society, and he opposed anyone, Catholic or Protestant, who let doctrine and disputation take precedence over pious humility and the practice of Christian principles. End of quote. The final humanist, the final individual I want to look at is Thomas More. Thomas More studied and practiced law before entering government service under Henry VIII. More is known for his writing of Utopia, which is a visionary work that placed him ahead of his time. Utopia describes an ideal socialistic community where there is absolute social equality. Now, to the approval of Marxists and socialists of the modern age, More had argued that private wealth was the result of greed and human cruelty, and he wanted to see private property abolished. He did not want to see there be anyone have ownership of property. Indeed, More believed that flawed institutions was responsible for corruption and violence. And this here kind of hints of Enlightenment thinking, centuries later. To reform and improve the individual, social institutions that molded the individual needed to be reformed. So again, you can see how this visionary work was ahead of its time. Okay, just to conclude, the work of the Renaissance writers gained greater attention with the arrival of the printing press. In the mid 1400s, Johann Gutenberg invented printing with movable type that made printing books easier and less expensive. Now, it's true, only a minority of the people could read, but the print revolution did much to encourage a critical frame of mind as readers studied and appreciated the Greek and Latin classics. Thank you.